Hello everybody and welcome back. Good to talk to all of you again today. And today is well, slightly different video than I would normally do, because today I'm addressing some inaccuracies from another video I watched. So earlier today I watched the video by the Infographics Show where they talked about the Yamato and the Iowa, and as the video was sponsored by World of Warships and Wargaming, you figured they would get things right. Unfortunately, that was not the case, and they got a whole bunch of things wrong. So I figured, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and make a video and address some of these inaccuracies and offer some corrections to the things that they said.
One of my favorite things in the game is that it includes some of the most iconic warships in naval history, like HMS Monarch and HMS Iron Duke.
And alright, let's talk about that first little clip. First things first, HMS Monarch, HMS Iron Duke. I don't think I would use the words iconic, because they really weren't iconic ships. I mean, Iron Duke, well known, sure. But, I mean, if you're talking about iconic ships, Warspite, Ark Royal, Hood, in the Royal Navy, I think would be more iconic. So that's like the first moment, right? And second, HMS Monarch. Well, unfortunately, the HMS Monarch in the modern all-big gun sense of a ship existed during the First World War, and it didn't exist in World of Warships. The HMS Monarch you see in World of Warships is this proposed King George V design. And there was a historical basis for the 15-inch armed version of the King George V. In fact, when the KG-5 class was first designed, there were three different versions: a 16-inch version, a 15-inch version, and a 14-inch version. And the 15-inch version was the one that was initially picked. And the reason for this is actually quite simple, because at the time, the Royal Navy already had a lot of ships armed with 15-inch guns. The technology, the means of production were all very mature, and would have been very easy to produce those kinds of guns and the turrets necessary. However, the British government at the time really wanted to limit battleship main gun caliber down to 14 inches. This, combined with a bit of a quirk in sort of how the ordering schedule went, because in order to have the guns ready for the ships, they had to be ordered by a certain date. And so, because of political desires to have 14-inch guns, and the fact that sort of negotiations were still ongoing, it was decided to go ahead and offer 14-inch guns instead of the originally proposed 15-inch gun design. And so the Monarch that we see in game, well, it is a complete sort of paper design, but there is, like I said, some historical basis for it.
Fast-moving destroyers might have been seen in the past sailing in numbers around the battleship. These days, you won't see that, as all modern navies only have destroyers in use.
Alright, again, too much of an absolute statement. It's not true. I guess I could give him half a mark, because a large proportion of the world's surface combatant fleet is comprised of guided missile destroyers. For example, the Arleigh Burke class that you see on your screen, that is serving the US Navy, the Type 45, which is serving with the Royal Navy, and ships like the Atago class guided missile destroyers, which are in service with the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. However, destroyers are definitely not the only ships in service in modern navies. Cruisers are still around. For example, the Kirov class cruisers in service with the Russian Navy. These behemoths of a ship, really you can classify them almost as modern day battle cruisers. Then the Russian Navy also has the Slava class cruisers that are still in service, along with, of course, the United States Navy, which happens to have Ticonderoga class cruisers. However, I do have to point out a little bit of extra things, which is that in the current day, the upper limit of guided missile destroyers are really starting to blur that line between, is it a destroyer or is it a cruiser? If you take a look at the third flight of the Arleigh Burke class destroyers, in terms of tonnage, in terms of weapons load, they're getting pretty close to the Ticonderoga. If you take a look at the proposed Type 55 destroyer that the People's Liberation Army Navy is proposing, and you look at the tonnage, you look at, for example, the weapons load, that ship really is getting to be on par with a Ticonderoga class cruiser. So, and of course, the Chinese still classified as a destroyer. So that line does get a little bit blurred, although still nothing is going to come close to the Kirov that you saw earlier on. Now, for a lot of navies in the world, there's no need to have big guided missile destroyers or cruisers. So they offer something a little bit smaller, multi-purpose frigates. So for example, this is the Halifax class of the Royal Canadian Navy. The South African Navy, for example, operates a couple of these Valor class frigates, which, by the way, just look absolutely gorgeous, mind you. And a third and final example is this French-built Lafayette class frigate in service with the Republic of China Navy. As you go one step down to even smaller ships, you'll have corvettes. For example, the Visby class corvette in service with the Swedish Navy, and of course the new littoral combat ships in service with the US Navy, although these are, I would say, maybe sort of supersized corvettes, but in terms of where they're supposed to operate, they are mostly used for operations in littoral waters. And after all this time, I've still only scratched the surface. There are a lot of ships in service with modern navies that are not destroyers. For example, you have ships as small as this 220-ton Type 22 missile boat in service right now with the People's Liberation Army Navy. So hopefully this has given you a slightly better picture of what kinds of ships are in service with modern navies today.
The Yamato, built in the Yamato province of Japan.
This is most certainly incorrect, as the Yamato was built at Kure Naval Arsenal, which, some of the dock facilities still exists today. It's part of Japan Marine United Corporation in Kure, Japan, somewhere close to Hiroshima. If you actually go very, very close to this area, you will actually see that right there is the Yamato Museum, or the Kure Maritime Museum. So if you ever happen to go to this particular region in Japan, make sure to check out this museum. They've got some pretty awesome things to look at, including a pretty large scale model of the Yamato.
She was sunk on April 7, 1945, and 2,498 crew were killed. It's said that until that time, Japan had thought this monster to be invincible.
I'm pretty sure this is not correct, because the Yamato had a sister ship, the Musashi, and this is a ship of identical design and construction, and she was lost before the Yamato was. In late 1944, many months before the Yamato was sent on her one-way trip to Okinawa, the Musashi was subjected to air attack by the US Navy, and after many bomb hits and torpedo hits, she was sent to the bottom. So I'm thinking the Japanese High Command was well aware that this particular class of battleships was not invincible.
She was hit, but never sunk. Her first hit was in 1944, when 2 Japanese projectiles hit turret 2 and 5, but the damage was not bad at all.
This, I think, is a small mistake, as an Iowa-class battleship doesn't have a turret number 5. What actually happened in March of 1944 was the Iowa was hit by 2 shells, a 6-inch shell and a 5-inch shell. The 6-inch shell hit near turret number 2, and the 5-inch shell hit near the hull plating.
In fact, the only battleship slugfest that did ever happen was the Battle of the Denmark Strait, when Germany's Bismarck and the cruiser Prince Eugene had a mean scrap with the British Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Hood. The Germans won.
Oh boy, yeah, this last statement, there was a lot of problems there. I mean, in terms of major naval engagements between battleships, where it was just like a full-on fight, it's quite a few, actually. One of the most famous being the Battle of Jutland during World War I, involving the High Seas Fleet and the Grand Fleet. And this was a fight of epic proportions, and all done by big gun battleships. If you talk about the aftermath of the Bismarck, yes, the Bismarck was successful initially against HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales, but the Bismarck's second engagement against HMS King George V and HMS Rodney did not go so well, as she was sent to the bottom of the ocean. So during World War II, mind you, there were a number of naval battles between battleships, and I'm only going to point out a few of them that were, I guess, quite well known. Another naval battle to talk about during the Second World War was the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, where the American battleships USS Washington engaged the Japanese battleship the Kirishima, and Kirishima was dispatched with lethal efficiency by the American battleship. The USS South Dakota, a South Dakota class battleship, was also present during this engagement. However, due to technical issues, her main guns did not engage the Japanese battleship. Moving on to another example, during the Battle of the Surigao Strait, the Japanese battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, pictured here, were engaged by US naval forces. Now, Fuso was taken out of the action before she got to engage US battleships, but the Yamashiro strayed into the path of 7 US battleships under the command of Jesse Oldendorf, and the American battleships at night were able to decimate the Yamashiro, sending her to the bottom. Moving on to another well-known battle, this time back in Europe, the HMS Duke of York engaged in a gunfight with the German battleship, the Scharnhorst, and in an engagement lasting a few hours, the Duke of York was able to come out victorious, sending the Scharnhorst to a watery grave. And so far, all the battles I've talked about are relatively the well-known ones where ships were sunk. There were, of course, other naval engagements during the Second World War involving battleships where ships were able to disengage. An example being the engagement between HMS Warspite and the Italian fleet at the Battle of Calabria, where HMS Warspite was able to score that extremely long-range hit on the Giulio Cesare, forcing the Italian ship to withdraw. Anyways, folks, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. It's a little bit different than what I usually do. If you have any other comments, please leave those in the comment section below. Aside from all that, take care, have yourselves a good one, and I'll talk to all of you again soon.